In this video, we're looking at the Steel Legend 9070 XT from ASRock up against the Prime 5070 Ti from Asus. These are both theoretically MSRP models, but as we'll discuss at the end of the video when I get more into the graphs and analysis and value, MSRP, at least right around launch so far on both cards, seems like it may or may not be a real thing. But first, let's establish the performance of these cards in a variety of situations. Here we are looking at Spider-Man Miles Morales at 4K very high, no upscaling, no ray tracing. We can see these are very similar in performance, so the 5070 Ti is 5% faster at 115 versus 110. Both are delivering a great experience. One of the big changes with this new generation of AMD products is enabling ray tracing in a lot of games now actually doesn't get you an unplayable experience. Notice that kicking on RT reflections at their very high settings, extended out to the 10 view distance and all that, actually still means at a native 4K resolution, the 9070 XT is able to hit 59 FPS with no upscaling. And the 5070 Ti is a little better, 65, and it increases its lead from 5% to 10%. But in previous generations of AMD versus NVIDIA, we would see that the ray tracing would cripple the AMD cards a lot more relative to the NVIDIA counterparts. And that was one of the selling points for the NVIDIA GPUs. Now we can see here that NVIDIA still pulled a little further ahead, but it wasn't a massive difference. Now, what about upscaling? This was also one of the big differences between previous generations of AMD and NVIDIA hardware, where AMD didn't have a machine learning-based upscaler. But here we're looking at FSR 4, and I have it up against DLSS 3. This is what's available in the game for DLSS. And also, I would say that these give a very similar image quality. DLSS 4 upscaling probably still has a little bit of an edge over FSR 4, and DLSS 3 and 4 are a lot closer. FSR 4 might be a little bit better in certain aspects, but it's fairly close. But you'll notice that FSR 4 runs a bit slower than DLSS 3. The 5070 Ti is now picking up to a 19% lead at 135 versus 113, but image quality is looking very good on both. Now, this is what happens if you do FSR 3 versus DLSS 3, because FSR 3 is still available. Notice that the performance gap goes closer to what it was at native resolution, where the 5070 Ti is now 12% ahead. The 9070 XT is now hitting 121 FPS. But now notice if you look at the image quality, if you look at Spider-Man's arm on FSR, there's a lot more ghosting trails behind it. If you look at like the fencing and tree branches in the distance, the building edges, there's way less stability, a lot of shimmering. It's quite distracting. So you can see that while performance-wise, FSR 3 is a better match for DLSS 3, image quality-wise, FSR 4 is a better match for DLSS 3. And DLSS 4, performance-wise, is more like FSR 4, but has a little bit of an image quality edge. So there's a lot going on with the upscalers right now, but it is nice to see the heavy improvement to image quality available with FSR 4. Now, if we drop down to 1440p, very high settings with RT reflections, there's not really a need for upscaling on either GPU, as both are already delivering a high refresh rate experience with the 9070 XT at 105 FPS and the 5070 Ti 10% ahead at 115 FPS. If we go ahead and turn off RT reflections, we now see that both GPUs are hanging out close to 200 FPS. We're seeing 195 versus 196, and frame rates are so high that there's potentially some other system limitations, CPU limitations, and things like that compressing the differences between the two GPUs, but both delivering an excellent experience. If we jump into Call of Duty Black Ops 6, we'll notice that this is generally an AMD-favored title, and we are seeing that continue with this generation of product. We see the 9070 XT take a 14% lead at 4K basic settings. Notice I'm using basic settings here, because I think that's more like how people actually play competitive titles online. They tend to turn down graphics settings to increase frame rates as well as visibility. Sometimes the higher graphics settings make it harder to spot enemies in the clutter or foliage, things like that. So that's why I'm using the basic settings here. And it's 149 FPS versus 131. Both are very playable, 14% lead for the 9070 XT. But I think a lot of times you would also kick on upscaling to try to boost performance. But again, with FSR 4 and DLSS 3 being fairly comparable in image quality, if I pit those head-to-head against each other, notice that now the 5070 Ti is actually faster by 12%. it's got 226 FPS versus 202 on the 9070 XT. So if you're using upscaling heavily here and you pit DLSS 3 versus FSR 4 for similar image quality, the 5070 Ti takes the lead due to the faster upscaling algorithm. Now, if I pit FSR 3 against DLSS 3, notice that the 9070 XT takes the lead by 5% in performance. But, well, this isn't an image quality analysis. If you pause the frame and if you're on a mobile, you can pinch to zoom and things like that, you'll notice a lot less detail preserved in the FSR side of the image, especially if you look at like lines in the distance, things like that, and there's more instability, ghosting, things like that. Now, 1440p basic settings with no upscaling, we get pretty high frame rates already, 252 versus 220, and it's a 15% lead for the 9070 XT. If we jump into Horizon Forbidden West at 4K max settings, which are called very high in this game, the 9070 XT has a 17% lead, so this does seem to be a good game here for the 9070 XT, and something weird's going on with the 1% lows on the 5070 Ti here. There's a bigger gap there. Both are getting good overall frame rates, considering this is native 4K on max settings, but if you go ahead and kick on FSR 4 versus DLSS 3 quality, which is fairly similar image quality, we now see the 9070 XT kind of lose its lead in the averages and reduce its lead in the 1% lows. And again, producing similar image quality. There are differences. Again, look at detailed FSR versus DLSS analysis videos for a full thoughts on the exact differences here. Now, if we switch it to FSR 3 versus DLSS 3, the 9070 XT takes a little bit of a lead and increases its lead in the 1% lows. Both are getting you around 100 FPS, though, and it's a similar overall frame rate. At 1440p, very high. I don't think we need upscaling here. The 9070 XT has an 8% lead in the averages and a bit of a larger lead in the 1% lows. In Indiana Jones and the Great Circle at 4K Supreme, this game always uses ray tracing, but I have not turned on the path tracing mode. 9070 XT is good for 64 FPS at native 4K, which is fine, but the 5070 Ti hits 83, which is 30% faster. If we drop down to 1440p Supreme settings, which again is the highest preset without turning on path tracing, we can see the 9070 XT reaching 104 FPS, which is great, but the 5070 Ti is a lot faster by 22% at 127 FPS. In Cyberpunk 2077, kicking on RT Ultra settings, this is not RT Overdrive, not the path tracing mode, but instead the highest ray tracing preset that's not path tracing. We do need to enable FSR and DLSS at the performance mode to get good frame rates here. Now, this game does not feature FSR 4, but it does feature DLSS 4. So here we're looking at DLSS 4 versus FSR 3, where DLSS 4 is the slower upscaling algorithm, but produces better image quality, so do keep that in mind, and you can see the side-by-side footage. If you look at things like the fencing in the background right here, you'll notice the FSR image is way less stable. If you look at the palm trees in the background, things like that. Massive image quality lead here, I would say, for the DLSS 4 image. And the 5070 Ti is 8% faster while doing it. But again, overall performance-wise, there's not a massive gap, but again, DLSS 4 does have a bit of a larger performance hit than FSR 3. Now, at 1440p RT Ultra, if we turn off any sort of upscaling, we get playable frame rates, maybe not the frame rates you'd want, so but still within the realm of reason here. The 9070 XT is hitting 51 FPS, and the 5070 Ti is averaging 62, giving the 5070 Ti a 22% advantage. Notice again that now you're not using the heavier upscaling algorithm on the 5070 Ti. These are both not using an upscaling algorithm. So this is probably closer to the true ray tracing performance differential in this test. Now, if you do want to use upscaling to try to boost performance here, both of them can probably get away with using quality level upscaling, but look at the bottles in the background here, way more flickering on the FSR image, things like that, because again, this game only supports FSR 3. There is not a driver toggle or an in-game option for FSR 4. Whereas there's an in-game option for DLSS 4. At the quality setting, this puts the 5070 Ti 10% ahead in frame rate at 98 versus 89, but I would say it is significantly better in image quality. Again, look at things like the fence line right here, the fans in the background, the palm trees in the background. The FSR image is quite shimmery, unstable, and fails to resolve as much detail as the DLSS 4 image does. If we do want to try out path tracing, the NVIDIA lead expands, although that doesn't mean the 5070 Ti is great for 4K path tracing. If we try to do 4K RT overdrive, we need to use performance mode upscaling, and I'm also enabling ray reconstruction with the new transformer model for the 5070 Ti, which helps a lot with the image quality. I would say the image here looks vastly better on the right-hand side of the screen, and the performance on the right-hand side is at least usable at 52 FPS, whereas the 9070 XT is hanging out at 35, which, you know, you could use, but especially given the upscaling artifacts required to get there, I don't think I would use these settings on the 9070 XT, whereas on the 5070 Ti, this would be at least something to consider if you're okay with, you know, a single-player game in kind of the 50 FPS range as opposed to a high refresh rate experience. And again, you could kick on frame generation. It's a little bit of a low base frame rate for that. Now, if we drop to 1440p and turn off any upscaling, the 5070 Ti is only able to average 35 FPS, which does put it 52% ahead of the 9070 XT at 23. And now these are actually producing the same workload because we're not using any upscaling or ray reconstruction or anything like that. So this is closer to the true difference in RT overdrive performance between the two GPUs. The 5070 Ti is 52% faster. I think it's fair to note that it's very clear that NVIDIA is heavily involved in the development of the path tracing mode in Cyberpunk, so it's unclear if there was a game that had a path tracing mode that was more helped by AMD, if maybe there are other ways of doing it that would perform better, but that's just not currently the case. In Cyberpunk, this is what you get with RT Overdrive. Now, at 1440p RT Overdrive, I think both GPUs would make sense to use some upscaling, and it helps performance significantly. Using quality level upscaling, again, DLSS 4 versus FSR 3, DLSS 4 being a heavier upscaling algorithm, but also providing a very noticeably better image quality. Again, look at the things in the background here. I think it looks noticeably better on the right-hand side of the screen, even without slowing down or zooming in. We see the 5070 Ti 45% faster at 64 versus 44. So a 5070 Ti is very usable at these settings. The 9070 XT is, I'm not saying you can't play a single-player game in the mid-40s, but arguably not the way you'd want to do it, especially given, again, look how flickery and unstable a lot of the upscaling and denoising looks on the left-hand side of the screen, because in addition to the worse upscaling algorithm here, they also don't have the AI denoiser like ray reconstruction enabled in this game. Although AMD did talk about a neural denoiser for path tracing workloads in their presentation, it's not currently implemented into any game that I know of, especially not Cyberpunk. Now, if you do drop to balanced mode upscaling, the 9070 XT can improve to 54 FPS, so from a frame rate perspective in a single-player game, you're getting into more playable territory. But the image quality is getting even worse on the left-hand side of the screen, whereas the 5070 Ti is now hitting 77 FPS, and I'd actually argue that with with DLSS 4 and the newer transformer model of ray reconstruction, balanced mode is actually pretty usable here on a 1440p display, and hitting 77 FPS. And that's a baseline before any frame generation is enabled, and I think 77 is plenty from which to use frame generation. So from here, I think the 5070 Ti could fill out a high refresh rate display and actually get a pretty good experience. So I think 1440p path tracing is usable on the 5070 Ti, but for the 9070 XT, I think we would need to see what it looked like with FSR 4 if it was enabled, and that's just not currently available, and there's no announcement for it coming to Cyberpunk. Now, let's jump into Ghost of Tsushima at 4K very high settings. The 9070 XT is taking a 15% lead at 75 versus 65. Both of these are very usable, and you don't necessarily need to use any upscaling, although personally I would still usually kick it on if I'm not getting at least 90 FPS-ish. That's kind of where I would stop adjusting things on a high-end system in my case. So if you do kick on quality level upscaling, the 9070 XT takes a 7% lead at 110 versus 103, but this is another game where there's no FSR 4. This has FSR 3.1, but as of the time of filming, AMD has not whitelisted the driver toggle for an FSR 4 implementation. So here I would say there's a bit of an image quality lead for DLSS 3 versus FSR 3, although 4K quality mode, FSR 3 is at least generally acceptable quality to use. as opposed to using the more aggressive settings or at lower resolutions. But again, noticeable image quality advantage to DLSS 3. At 1440p, very high settings, which again are the max settings available in the game, I don't think you need any upscaling here. And the 9070 XT is 13% faster at 126 versus 112, although the 5070 Ti is certainly giving you a good experience at 112 FPS. In God of War at 4K Ultra, this game tends to be a bit more NVIDIA favored, and we see the 5070 Ti take a 6% advantage at 73, which is less nice than a 69 for the 9070 XT though, so do keep that in mind. Now, if we kick on upscaling, this game does have an FSR 4 toggle, and again, versus DLSS 3, which has similar image quality but a bit of a faster algorithm, so we'll pair them up this way, we see the 5070 Ti producing 12% better frame rate and roughly similar image quality. Again, there's pros and cons of FSR 4 versus DLSS 3. You might prefer one over the other. 100 FPS versus 89, so both are giving you a good experience. But 5070 Ti was faster. Now, if we do switch to FSR 3, which again at 4K quality mode is pretty usable, although does produce a worse image than DLSS 3 does, the 9070 XT is now hitting 95 FPS, which gives the 5070 Ti a 5% lead in frame rate, but a more measurable advantage in image quality being produced. At 1440p Ultra in God of War, we have 5070 Ti at a 6% advantage at 112 FPS versus 106, and I think in this case I wouldn't bother kicking on upscaling on either GPU. In Silent Hill 2 at 4K epic settings, you would probably want to enable some upscaling here. And again, this was another game where the FSR implementation didn't seem to have a driver toggle for an FSR 4 implementation. So this is FSR 3 versus DLSS 3 performance. I think there's a lot more fizzling and ghosting. Look at the hair. It looks way better with DLSS. And performance-wise, the 5070 Ti is also taking a 20% lead in performance, as well as better image quality. So definitely a big win here for the 5070 Ti. If you kick on hardware ray tracing, and this is one of the few Unreal Engine 5 games on PC that offers the hardware version of Lumen on PC, we see the 5070 Ti at a 22% advantage, so slightly increasing its lead, and we're still using performance mode upscaling to get good frame rates here. 79 versus 65 FPS, so frame rate wise, they're both very playable, but again, look at things like the hair, just overall detail, as things are disoccluded. The image on the right-hand side of the screen is looking better in addition to the 22% performance advantage. At 1440p epic settings without hardware RT, the 5070 Ti is 27% faster here at 84 versus 66. And again, this appears to be just a very NVIDIA-favored title from a performance standpoint, and I've seen that in other GPU comparisons that I've made. This title just seems to favor NVIDIA over AMD. If we turn on hardware ray tracing on the 1440p epic settings, we now see the 5070 Ti at an 18% advantage at 65 versus 55. So actually here it's not seeing like the hardware ray tracing is a major disadvantage for AMD or anything. It's just that the game overall is a bit of a disadvantage for AMD. If we kick on quality level upscaling to boost frame rates here, the 5070 Ti is still 18% faster at 91 versus 77. But again, if you look at things like the hair, objects being disoccluded, things like that, I would say the DLSS image looks noticeably better since it's no FSR 4 available in this title as of the time of filming. Hellblade 2 is another Unreal Engine 5 showcase. This one does not feature any hardware RT. And at 4K high settings, that is the highest available in the game. There's no Ultra or anything like that. The GPUs are basically tied. We're seeing a 2% advantage for the 9070 XT at 45 versus 44. But if you think the 5070 Ti looks a little bit weirdly aliased, I would agree. On all my 50 series cards, the native TSR implementation looks very aliased. Look at the tree branches and things like that. So they seem to be having a graphical artifact on the 50 series cards in this game, at least on the review drivers I used at the time of review. The 30 and 40 series cards on the same review driver didn't seem to have the same issue. Now, kicking on DLSS quality and FSR quality, again, no FSR 4 available here. Performance jumps to 75 or 73, so again, still a very similar experience. 3% ahead in the averages for the 9070 XT and 10% in the 1% lows. However, here I would say that DLSS is producing the better image. So similar performance with a better image, I would consider a win for the 5070 Ti. And we're no longer seeing the aliasing issue now that we've switched over to the DLSS pathway. So it just seems to be some sort of an issue with the TSR pathway. At 1440p high settings, no ray tracing. Again, look at the tree branches and things in the distance right now on the right-hand side. Weird aliasing, things aren't correct here. So again, the 50 series cards are having some sort of an issue in this game. I did email NVIDIA about it during the review process, but never got a reply. I imagine they're pretty busy right now. Anyway, the 9070 XT is 5% ahead at 78 versus 74, but 15% ahead in the 1% lows. At 4K Ultra in Final Fantasy 16, the 9070 XT is 2% ahead, but that's just 48 versus 47, so you would probably want a higher frame rate. So if you kick on DLSS and FSR3 performance, now we're getting 92 and 93. 5070 Ti is 1% ahead in frame rate, but again, because I did not see an FSR4 toggle available here, it's, again, unfortunate. I'm really hoping the game support list grows quickly for FSR4, because that seems to be the main disadvantage with it right now, besides a little bit of a harder performance hit compared to the DLSS 3. At 1440p Ultra, we're seeing the 9070 XT 5% ahead at 84 versus 80, and 3% ahead in the 1% lows. And frame rates are high enough that I don't think we need any upscaling or anything. And that is the tests that I ran on these two GPUs. So let's pop out for a little bit of a summary. So first of all, let's look at some graphs. Now, when I do this style of graph, it's important to explain what you are looking at. So I have decided for one GPU to be, these are measuring the percentage differences in each game. This is not frame rate, it's how many percent faster one GPU was compared to the other. Now, I have determined the 5070 Ti to be in the positive direction. So when you see something like this, this right here saying 12, that means in this particular game, the 5070 Ti was 12% faster. So what are these negative numbers over here? Well, this negative 15 here means that in this particular game, the 9070 XT was 15% faster. And I have computed both of them as which one is faster by a certain percentage. So I do the faster one divided by the slower one to produce a percentage differential, and then I assign a negative value to one of the GPUs. So that's what you're looking at here. Because if you just, I don't need to get in the way the percentages work, but that way it's not artificially making one have bigger numbers than the other due to the direction of the division. Anyway, so when you're looking at this, you can clearly see that the 5070 Ti has more stuff in the positive direction than the 9070 XT has in the negative direction, meaning if you look at all of the tests that I ran here, the 5070 Ti is better. And the geomean of these results is that the 5070 Ti is 8% faster overall as an average of all of the tests that I ran. Do note, though, that its largest leads are in the heaviest ray tracing workloads like RT Overdrive in Cyberpunk. So another way of looking at this data set is like this, where I've sorted the results from best result for the 5070 Ti, which is what we're seeing up here, down to best result to the 9070 XT, which we're seeing right here, and we got this 0 baseline as like these are basically a tie right in the middle here. So you can see again in this way of looking at it, the 5070 Ti, at least in this data set, again, you can choose different games to test and more ray tracing or less ray tracing and all of that, but at least in this data set, this is what this looks like. But if some of you guys are like, well, let's filter out for things like just ray tracing and just not ray tracing separately. Now, personally, I'm not sure that that's completely like the 5070 Ti is strong enough that you can usually use ray tracing. So I think just choosing to artificially segment this out is a thing you can do for analysis, but is not necessarily something you would do when actually using these GPUs. So do keep that in mind. But if we do just sort out the ray tracing results, I have the 5070 Ti averaging 23% faster. But it is important to note when you're measuring ray tracing performance that your game and settings selection will heavily influence the results. If I did nothing but path tracing workloads, we would probably see the 5070 Ti average even faster compared to the 9070 XT. But if I did nothing but extremely light ray tracing workloads, we would probably see these results way closer. So if you're getting completely different results from other reviews you've seen in ray tracing, keep in mind that that's why. It really just heavily depends on the type of ray tracing workload. I tried to put a balance of some path tracing, some heavy RT but not path tracing, and some lighter ray tracing to kind of show all of those types of situations. But again, there's no right answer, no one right answer on exactly how you should measure ray tracing differentials between two GPUs. What is clear is the 5070 Ti is better at ray tracing than the 9070 XT. And the heavier the ray tracing workload, it seems like it maybe expands its lead, especially in path tracing stuff. Now, if we go ahead and switch to the opposite of this and go, what if we only looked at no ray tracing results? This is what we see. So if I filter out all of the ray tracing results, I'm now actually getting the 5070 Ti as 1% slower, but I think a better way of looking at this is they're basically tied. You'd have your exact game selection list would probably swing this result a few percent in one direction or the other. But the thing is, plus or minus 5% performance isn't something you really notice if you're not running a frame rate counter. So in other words, I would say if you're not using ray tracing, performance is fairly similar, but depending on exactly which game you're playing, you can see double-digit percentage leads for one or the other. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, if you want to sort this from best result for the 5070 Ti to best result for the 9070 XT, this is what this chart looks like here. So you can certainly see that game by game, certain games favor one brand over the other. It's looking like things like Silent Hill 2 and God of War are good results for NVIDIA, whereas games like Ghost of Tsushima, Call of Duty Black Ops 6 are good results for AMD. But once you start pitting a heavier upscaling algorithm versus a not as heavy upscaling algorithm, something like FSR 4 versus DLSS 3, we can see sometimes that will skew things in the other direction for NVIDIA due to the quicker upscale for similar image quality. Now, if you're like, but there's still upscaling in here. Yeah, because I think that's a realistic use case for a lot of people. However, if you're just like, I just want to buy a 1440p GPU, and I'm not going to turn on ray tracing, and I'm not going to turn on upscaling. So if I filter out all of those results, and I do a lot of those results because I think those are realistic use cases for these cards, but maybe as a buyer, you're watching this review saying, I'm not going to use upscaling, and I'm not going to use ray tracing, and I'm on a 1440p display. These are powerful GPUs. They can handle it. Fair enough. Here's the results. So if we're looking at that, I see the 5070 Ti overall 2% slower, but again, I would in general just call this roughly a tie, although there's clearly outliers where in certain games, one GPU might be double digits faster than the other. For example, the 9070 XT is a 15% faster in Call of Duty Black Ops 6, 13% faster in Ghost of Tsushima, whereas in Silent Hill 2, we have the 5070 Ti like 27% faster, right? So it really just depends on what game you're playing. Some of them will favor AMD over NVIDIA a lot more than others. But here's kind of where we need to get into the big elephant in the room is that what are these, so which one's the better buy here? Well, that really depends on the price, because I would say that I think it's very clear that the 5070 Ti is better. DLSS 4 probably still has an image quality edge at about the same performance as FSR 4 and is available in more games. DLSS 3 offers fairly similar image quality to FSR 4 and is available in more games and runs a little bit faster. And if we look at ray tracing results, we can see that the 5070 Ti is still better at that. And if you're not ray tracing, they have similar performance. It varies a bit game by game. So I would say overall, the 5070 Ti is the better product. And again, the average of all of my results, including various upscaling and ray tracing settings, is the 5070 Ti is about 8% better overall, performance-wise. But again, your game selection and how you do this could vary things wildly. Now, let's do a little bit of math. If we pretend MSRPs are real, and the 5070 Ti is at $750 and the 9070 XT is at $600, that means that the 5070 Ti is theoretically 25% more expensive for 8% more performance, which means that if you divide that, it's actually only offering about 86.4% of the value of the 9070 XT. Or another way of looking at that is, we're talking like 14% or so better value for the AMD GPU if MSRPs were real. Now, there's other ways of looking at that. For example, if you just went off of rasterized performance, where they're roughly tied, you could say that AMD is offering like 25% better performance because it's roughly the same rasterized performance for 25% more money on the 5070 Ti. But again, I think the 5070 Ti is strong enough that using ray tracing and things like that is very usable and is a realistic thing to consider in your buying decision, depending on the types of games that you like to play. Anyway, the problem with all of this is like, this isn't real, right? That's not real. So I don't know how to value these. Like, I think we're still too close to launch to get a real idea of where these are going to settle. Lots of 9070 XTs sold at their MSRP on launch day, but then retailers said that that was only because AMD was providing rebates in a limited quantity, and once those rebates ran out, they started listing the same models that were supposed to be MSRP for a higher price because that was closer to their actual cost. Now AMD has responded trying to say that they're going to continue to make it possible and encourage retailers to offer MSRP models, but we have yet to see how effective that actually is and in what sort of quantities. 5070 Ti's, on the other hand, had very few MSRP models available and have had very little supply in general, and most of the supply and restocks we're getting are on the higher priced models. If I try to buy these GPUs new right now, I could look at something like PC Part Picker, and if I sort prices low to high, 5070 Ti's seem to be starting around $1,000 for stuff that, and going up quickly from there for cards that are actually in stock new. And actually on these $1,000 ones, a lot of times when I jump in, the listing hasn't updated in time and it's actually sold out, which is very possible here. And they seem to be more readily available, even a little bit above the $1,000 price point. Whereas the 9070 XT were very close to launch, so most of the listings that were at all reasonable are just gone, and that's leaving us with over $1,000 pricing here. So that's the new market, which is what I usually base things on. Now, in this case, I could go ahead and look at something like eBay and sort it by completed listings, so we're seeing what things actually sold for. And in this case, if I'm looking at 5070 Ti's, they range from $830-ish all the way up into the well over $1,000 range. But I am seeing this available inventory graph showing that the vast majority of products are right around the $1,000 price point. So it does look like the majority of 5070 Ti's kind of available at buy it now pricing and where they're selling at seem to be around the $1,000 price point. Now 9070 XTs, again, are very closer to their launch date, so I don't know how fair this is. And I don't see many. I see like one completed listing at MSRP. The rest seem to very quickly get into the $700 plus range, but it's seeming like that $700 to $800 range is kind of the median, although many models are going up into the $900 plus range. But again, the overall ceiling on the prices for these do seem to generally be lower. If I had to kind of ballpark what seems like it's fairly typical, we might say $1,000 for the 5070 Ti and something like $800 for the 9070 XT. And that, once again, is a 25% price split and doesn't actually affect the value analysis, which is kind of interesting. Now, depending on what you choose to make these numbers, though, based on how you're reading the general market, that's kind of gonna swing this in different directions. Like, for example, if you could get 9070 XTs for around $730, which does seem like where some of them listed once the MSRP rebates disappeared, then, and if the 5070 Ti's aren't really available for maybe under like 900-ish, seems to be where some of them come in stock, when you're actually able to get one listed new and it hasn't gone out of stock yet, well, then we're talking still a similar kind of pricing gap. So anyway, this really depends a lot on where things end up settling. So I think in general, if you're looking on the used market or the new market and what happens to be in stock, if the 5070 Ti and the 9070 XT are at a similar price point, I think the 5070 Ti is the better GPU. They have the same amount of VRAM. The upscaling situation as far as game support list and even the maximum quality when you have DLSS 4 available does seem to be better with NVIDIA. And the overall ray tracing performance is better as well, although AMD has been doing an admirable job this generation of trying to close some of that gap. So If they're similar in price, I'd grab the 5070 Ti. In general, I would try to wait for the GPU market to settle down a bit before buying right away, though. That's my overall recommendation. But again, if you see something pop into stock and like maybe we're like, oh, should I grab it at that price point? Again, just kind of look at what's available on the market. And hopefully you at least have all of the performance data you need here to make a well-reasoned decision based on what the current market looks like when you are researching and watching this video to get your help. I hope you guys found this video useful and or interesting. I have tons of other head-to-head comparisons already available and tons more in the pipeline for all of the relevant new GPU launches, so feel free to stay tuned to the channel if you're interested in all of that, and I hope all of you have an excellent day. A huge thank you to channel members, subscribers, viewers, all of that. You're all beautiful people.